All right. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon or good morning if you're watching this in the morning. Welcome to our Student and Family Services webinar focused on helping students adapt and thrive during COVID-19. Today, we are joined by our fabulous school psychologist, Dr. Diana Joyce, as well as one of her school psychology students, Jess Fazoli. She's going to join us as well. And our goal today is to understand student resilience and share strategies on ways families can support their students during this unprecedented time. So we hope that you enjoy this presentation. And if there are any questions, you can ask them in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll be able to take them throughout the presentation. So I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Joyce.
Thank you, Dr. Pennypacker Hill. We appreciate the opportunity to work with your students here at PK Yonge and the families who entrust that to us. And what we hope to do today is kind of share some of the strategies that are available at PK, but then also to share some things that we can do as parents as well in the home environment. So our objectives are going to be to understand resilience during epidemics and times of change. And we'll just briefly take a historical look at that. We also are going to talk about recognizing student stress, when those levels might be a concern, and the levels of support services that are available here at PK. Following that, Jess is going to talk about executive functioning supports for students. She's currently interning here at PK and is providing direct services. Some of you may have met her already, but she's going to share some information on how to assist in that way. And then we are going to finish up with adult modeling strategies for helping our students and a list of resources as well. So the good news, the takeaway messages that I would hope everyone would have after this webinar is that children and adolescents are generally very adaptive. Some may argue that they're more adaptive than we are as adults. So that's encouraging to know. We also know that throughout history, when there have been epidemics, children and adolescents are generally resilient with the assistance of their families and also the support networks that they have within their communities and schools. We also know that there are many ways that caregivers and schools can successfully support the adaptation and resilience of their students. And we'll talk a little bit more about those today. So in thinking about the resilience that children and adolescents have, I always like to remind myself of the developmental stages and the huge number of adjustments that children successfully make. It's sometimes easy to forget that and take that for granted, but it does set the stage for understanding how quickly they can learn and how quickly they can change strategies and adapt and exhibit resilience. So if we think about the average preschooler in about 60 months, starting at 4 hours after birth, they're already learning how to eye track. They're already learning how to read emotions on the faces of those that are looking at them and talking to them and responding. Very quickly, they start exhibiting motor coordination skills, the ability to sit up and walk. They acquire language, at least understanding how to respond to it initially, and then learning how to exhibit vocabulary, pronounce it correctly, and communicate with caregivers. They're learning toileting. That's not something they understood at first. How to put on clothing, including buttons and zippers and different types of garments. They're learning how to draw and sort objects. They're learning that symbols can be letters and that symbols also can be numbers. They learn about games. They learn that games have different rules. Peekaboo is very different from hide and seek. and they quickly understand that you have different sets of expectations in one context, for example, peekaboo, than you would from hide and seek. And these are the same kinds of strategies that we use when we're adapting to change, as we begin to understand that there are different contexts that require different types of behaviors from us. They also learn imagination, how to pretend, how to stand in line and take turns, how to share, and started developing empathy and emotional regulation. And the thing that's dearest to all of our hearts is they do learn to love us as parents and to respond to family and friends. So that's quite a quick progression in 5 years. If you told me I had to relearn all of those things, including a new language, in the next 60 months, it would seem like a daunting task. But I think it just speaks to how adaptive children and adolescents are and how they naturally have this ability. By elementary, most will be about 120 months old at that time. They've learned to read and write, to do math, to create art. They understand science and social studies at different levels. They're learning how to compete athletically in group games like soccer. They also are learning how to build relationships, and they're learning about moral development, value systems, and how to weigh pros and cons of different choices and behavior, and how to navigate different social expectations. So what's expected at home versus what's expected at Walmart when I'm standing in line, or what might be expected at school. So another example of just tremendous adaptation and change. By middle school, they're learning advanced literary analysis, critical thinking skills, often a second language class, taking language arts, maybe performing arts or competitive sports. They also are learning about possibly holding a part-time job or job responsibilities within the home, and enhancing their interpersonal skills and exhibiting greater independence. And that's where we start to see them moving into that transition to adulthood, is where they start exhibiting that independence. By 216 months, most of them are ready to move on to that next stage of life, ready to graduate. They can drive a car now and can be pretty assertive and direct in that need for independence. They also navigate romantic relationships, which are complicated. And they learn career preparation. They make choices about where they want to go with their careers, what they would like to do. And they start becoming more and more self-reliant and independent thinkers and independent behavior actions at that stage. So from cradle to diploma, I think there's very strong evidence that they do have the ability to adapt very quickly and in sophisticated ways. And that would include adapting to things like COVID, things like unusual circumstances and safe at home mandates, and some of the other things that our communities right now are experiencing. And thinking historically about epidemics, these have existed for a very long time. Even as early as the 1st century, Hippocrates talked about and described mumps epidemics and outbreaks that affected entire communities and had very poor outcomes for many children. Of course, at that time, they didn't have the medical understanding that we have, but they managed those with quarantines. And in those early writings, there are references to children dealing with quarantine and families embracing quarantine to help the community as well, and that behavior action. By the 14th, 16th century, we had other outbreaks of other epidemics. Some of those reoccurred over 100 years, multiple times. 1500s, we had measles, and there are writings in that medical literature of how families were learning about sanitation. So how to improve their environment through washing things and keeping things cleaner and not touching, for example, sores that might be infected. And so they're learning those things like our children are learning now about the use of masks and the use of wiping surfaces and keeping surfaces clean. Later in the 1800s, we have the first medical writings around inoculations. Those weren't as sophisticated as they are now. They were more of a scratch and exposing that scratch or that open wound to some infection from a sore on someone else. So crude in nature, but definitely a progression in learning how to protect oneself from these type of epidemics. Later in the 1960s to 1955, we had polio outbreaks in the US that were quite traumatic. Many of the cities used quarantine for all children within the city. Some closed schools, beaches, playgrounds, and they ultimately came to understand that was transmitted through water and often through summer camps and exposure to water that had pollution in it. So all of these were adaptations that children and adolescents as a community have successfully made to prior epidemics and are examples for us today. The things that have been learned historically through epidemics and those that are older, like the ones we just talked about, but also more recent in history, is that despite the continent they're exhibited on, whether it's Asia, Africa, Europe, here in the US, that children generally are very resilient and most are going to go on and lead productive adult lives with very little effect from those epidemics that is long term. There are going to be some, though, that will exhibit higher levels of anxiousness, depressive feelings, and also some obsessive behaviors. So some behaviors that are a little bit too frequent or too stressful for students. And it's for those students that we want to be alert and also think about supplemental services PK Yonge can offer to help with that transition, and then things that we can do as the adults in their life as well. So some alert signals to anxiousness, depressive feelings, or obsessive behaviors would include changes in their sleep or eating patterns. So as parents and caregivers, we know what's typical for our individual children. And what we're looking for are changes that would be very different from their normal pattern. And that might be problematic as well. So we want to be alert to that. If we see excessive worry or sadness or exhaustion, those might be signals that it's time to reach out for a little bit of help from school and family. And I think the key word there is excessive, because a certain amount of worry actually can be adaptive. It makes us stop and think, it makes us put on our mask, it makes us keep a little distance, it makes us think about the cleanliness of shared objects. So it can have value, but it's when it begins to interfere with our functioning that it's become excessive, it's become counterproductive. And so that would be an alert signal to us. Also, if we see children that are becoming easily upset and angry, and that's not typical for them, or they're losing interest in things they always enjoyed, that would be an alert signal as well. If we see helplessness or loss of hope, that would be something we'd want to intervene pretty quickly. And if we see an overemphasis on cleaning rituals or germs, contamination, we also might want to intervene at that time. So as an example, right now, there's an expectation that we would be washing our hands more frequently. That's a good, healthy response to COVID. It's a good precaution. And I believe the the guideline is that we would wash hands the equivalent of 20 seconds, which is the same amount of time it takes to sing happy birthday. So if I see a child doing that repeatedly throughout the day, that's not a concern. That's actually something to be proud of, and something to celebrate, because that's a good habit right now. However, if they're doing that for 20 minutes, or if they're doing that every 5 minutes of the day and they haven't touched anything, and there's no logical reason for it, then they've begun to overemphasize and they've become hypervigilant. So those would be alert signals for us as parents. In terms of when this might become serious enough for intervention outside the school as well, and maybe contacting our mental health community for extra support. Generally, the prevalence rates for diagnosable anxiety or depression or obsessive compulsive behaviors are quite low. And as you can see from this graph, generally things like anxiety, that's on the far left. If you put all of the forms of anxiety together, only about 8% of children are ever going to reach that level. If we're thinking about that increasing 50%, which would be dramatic under epidemic circumstances, we're still only up to 12. So I think this reemphasizes that even though we could see increases in some of these things, by and far, the majority of children are not going to exhibit that level. When they do, however, we do have support systems in place here at PK, and strategies that we can consult with families on helping to ameliorate that very quickly. What we don't want to do is have something become chronic or long-term. So at PK Yonge, as you know from the handbook, we do have a multi-tiered system of support. In this illustration, we're talking about 3 tiers. That bottom green area of this diagram is universal, or tier 1. Those are supports that every student here is receiving, regardless of whether or not there's any additional need. For those who are still exhibiting some areas, maybe academically or in terms of behavior, maybe anxiousness, that seem to need additional support beyond what's being done for everyone in the classroom, that would be considered a tier 2. And so we can add on some small group strategies and some additional supports to help them. If this still isn't quite enough, we also have an option to add on a 3rd tier, which is going to be more intensive, more comprehensive, and most likely individualized. And that would be the red area in the graph. So generally a small percentage. And hopefully by responding quickly, being alert, we can put these supports in place so that we reduce the need for those over time and reduce that stress or that academic achievement concern really quickly for them. So that's the model. In terms of what PK is doing specifically at each tier, at that universal tier, that tier 1, in lieu of COVID and current community circumstances, teachers are already trained in what to look for in terms of alert changes. So they're going to be noticing irritability, confusion, unusual boredom or lack of motivation. They also are going to understand that students need regular information on COVID and COVID precautions, and that's going to be built in at that tier 1. They'll be alert to low moods or excessive fear. And they also are going to be reiterating the need for voluntary precautions, so wearing masks, keeping social distance. They also are aware that with virtual learning and COVID and spacing children out in classrooms, that learning instruction may be delivered somewhat differently. There's a greater need for technology, for example, in virtual learning. And so all of those materials they already have available, they're aware of, they're alert to the need, and they're monitoring. So all of this universal intervention is already in place. And as teachers have that awareness, what you'll see on the right are some of the things that they have put in place to address that. So they have routines and schedules to give students a familiar base that they can depend on for the structure of schooling and instruction. They also are going to give advance notice when there are changes. For example, we have a change coming in the school schedule tomorrow. And so there's been advance notification of that and awareness of preparing students for any additional changes. They also are working with students on empowering them in these new forms of instruction and giving explanations when they need to and reminders around the precautions that we want to take so that everyone is safe. In addition, they're aware of the need for extra encouragement at times, for really monitoring engagement, and they have professional skills in doing that very effectively. In progress monitoring, they also engage in that frequently. And in thinking about infrastructure needs. So students' Chromebooks, students' internet access, the school has systems level strategies there for all of Tier 1 to help support those needs. They also have systems level structures for homeschool communication and making sure that as parents, we're always aware of what's occurring in the school system, any changes that are happening, and the supports and how to access those. So these are all in place for all of the students. We talked earlier in the diagram about Tier 2. What happens if, given all of those supports at that Tier 1, a student is still starting to struggle academically or maybe emotionally? Again, as you'll see on the left-hand side of this slide, teachers are aware of what to look for alert symbols when they feel like there might be a Tier 2 risk. And they also have strategies, as you see on the right-hand side, for addressing those. So some of those risk factors might be chronic irritability, and these also could be risk factors that you are seeing at home as parents and caregivers and may want to alert us in the school system about as well. If we're seeing repeated anger, chronic boredom, mood that's persistently low or flat would be an indicator that we need additional Tier 2 supports. If there's a lack of engaging in safety measures or exhaustion. Additionally, we know that having family members who might be sick can be another stressor. And so those would be alert systems that we need additional support beyond Tier 1. Or if the family has lost income, that also can be an additional stressor. And so at PK, some options that we have at Tier 2 that can be put in place very quickly include counseling for the students, whether that's individual or small group. And it would be addressing all of those things you see on the left-hand side of the slide. We also have strategies and counseling around improving motivation, enhancing their interest, and ways to re-engage if students are starting to withdraw from us a little bit. Additionally, there are executive functioning coaching strategies that are available. And in just a couple of minutes, Jess is going to talk more about that. She also is spearheading some support systems around executive functioning. On the systems level, Student and Family Services also reaches out to collaborate with families. When we see things that need Tier 2 support, the school reaches out, but also the school is hopeful that as families encounter things that may need Tier 2 support, For example, a family member who's sick and a parent that feels the child could use some extra support. Reaching out to us as well is really helpful in letting us know so that we can put those supports in place right away and discuss with you as caregivers what you think might be best, the best level of support at this time. The school also has the ability to connect families with community supports and try to help network additional supports that may be available even beyond PK. So that next intensive level would be students who have all the universal supports and some tier 2 supports, but still are struggling either academically or on the emotional side. And we still have more strategies that we can apply in addition to the tier 1 and tier 2. Some examples of when tier 3 strategies may be needed would include bereavement, if there are intensive behavior or academic concerns. That would be a time we'd want to give support as soon as possible. If there's a need for very individualized counseling, very unique circumstances, that would often be an indicator too that we need to set up some tier 3 supports. So for those, we can offer individualized counseling, collaboration with outside care providers. Sometimes families may want to also seek counseling in the community, and we can collaborate with those care providers and come up with plans that support your students here that are consistent with what you're also seeking assistance with in the community. If students are on an IEP or a 504, it may be important to kind of look at that and see if there are changes that are needed, maybe updates, and those are options as well if that need arises. And then again, helping families connect with community supports and resources that we're aware of that may be beneficial. On that administrative level at tier 3, PK Yonge can also collaborate individually with families on unique circumstances they're experiencing and look at that from a systems level support lens and try to brainstorm ways to provide additional help during those times of stress. So each of those tiered levels are already built out within PK's instructional delivery and counseling and school psychology supports and can be very easily accessed. In terms of executive functioning, Jess is going to share with us some things to be alert to if this need is prevalent, and then also ways to intervene.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Joyce. All right, so we're going to be talking about executive functioning. And first, we're going to start with what is executive functioning? Essentially, it's the management system of our brain. So it's a set of mental skills to help us learn, work, and manage our life. And notice I said skills. These are not innate abilities. These are skills, which means they can be learned, and most importantly, they can be taught. They do start to develop from age 2, but they are not fully developed until about age 30. So we usually expect students to have executive functioning skills, but they're not actually fully developed until well into adulthood. Importantly, executive functioning skills are delayed in some individuals, including individuals with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or ADHD, and sometimes even in adulthood, executive functioning skills in these individuals never fully develop. Executive functioning involves a lot of different aspects, most importantly, working memory, which is our ability to hold information in our brains temporarily while we use it to make a plan or decide something or take an action. Flexible thinking, which is thinking through solutions to problems and managing situations when unplanned problems arise, and inhibitory control, or our ability to control our behavior, urges, and impulses. These are all very important. I don't have control of the slide. Thank you. So why is executive functioning important? It is extremely important because without it, we could not pay attention, organize, plan, prioritize, start a new task, end an old task, understand other people's perspectives, regulate our emotions, or self-monitor our behavior. So basically, everything that we need to be successful in life revolves around executive functioning. What I've learned recently is that a lot of students equate executive function to intelligence. And it's very, very sad. It's absolutely not related. Executive function is a skill. It is something that can be taught and learned. So it does not equal intelligence. Adults do expect children to have executive functioning skills without explicitly teaching it. And this is kind of an interesting phenomenon because we would never expect a child to know how to ride a bike or know how to read without actually being taught those skills. So we also need to explicitly teach these skills. And when I say adults, I mean all adults. Both parents and teachers have this assumption. We could all use a little understanding of this concept. Go ahead. Next slide. Excellent. So let's talk a little bit about how we use executive functioning. It seems like riding a bike and reading, well, those are hard things to do. So why is executive functioning, planning, or remembering something so difficult? So let's talk about a simple example like making a doctor's appointment. And let's think about what aspects of executive function are necessary for this 5-minute task. So the first thing you have to do is identify a medical concern. So you need to be paying attention. Go ahead. Remember any symptoms you noticed. So you need working memory. So you can tell the nurse exactly why you need a doctor's appointment. You need to find the right medical specialist. So you need to prioritize. You need to find a phone number. You need to plan. How are you going to find this phone number? You need to call the office when it's actually open. So you need to start a new task and you need to plan. You need to remember your availability, and that involves working memory and organization. You need to plan and adjust your schedule accordingly. So this involves a lot of flexible thinking. And if you do have to miss school or work because of this doctor's appointment, you need to let them know. And that involves planning and understanding other people's perspectives. So as you can see, in a 5-minute task that seems easy, we do it all the time, it takes a lot of executive functioning skills. Go ahead. So what does executive function difficulty look like in students? I'm just going to give you 6 examples. There are so many different ways that executive function difficulty could present in a child. So they could be sitting in front of a computer for hours and hours and hours and not actually accomplishing anything. It could look like completing homework and then forgetting to turn it in. It could look like forgetting what the homework is in the first place, or when classes, and this is especially true of Zoom classes. It could look like requiring daily reminders to do something that your child, quote, should know how to do already, like feed the pet or pack a backpack. It could look like not paying attention, so doodling, staring blankly, wandering aimlessly, when lecture or projects are just not stimulating enough. Or it could look like when something doesn't go as planned, your child freezes and does nothing. Or even worse, they attempt the same unsuccessful strategy over and over again. So now we know what it looks like. Let's talk a little bit about how we can increase it, because it is a skill that can be taught and learned. So the first thing that can help students with executive functioning difficulties is breaking a task down. So literally going step by step, like we did with medical, calling a doctor example, step by step. But remember, students with executive function difficulties do not hold information in their brains for very long. That's the working memory aspect. So you should write the steps down. You can be very explicit at first so they can reference it, and eventually over time, they'll be able to do that without looking at every single step. You can also use a schedule or a planner. I recommend and. It's best to have information presented visually so you can understand times of day that you have time available to work on something, but also it helps you understand what you spend your time doing. Another aspect is modeling prioritizing, and I know we're going to be talking about modeling after, but I wanted to specifically mention modeling prioritizing. So this can be talking through the most important aspects of what you're going to do and why. So say you have to do two things, like maybe cooking dinner and doing laundry, and they both need to be done. An example of modeling how you prioritize and how you think it through is, well, I have to make dinner before 7 o'clock tonight because we have to go to music practice, and the laundry needs to be done, but it doesn't need to be done for another couple of days because the uniform that's in the laundry isn't needed for until game day in a couple of days. So I'm going to choose the task that needs to be done more quickly, and that's the most important one that needs to be done now. So it sounds a little odd and childish, but talking through the way you think about things will really help ingrain that into your child's mind, thinking about how to prioritize, because students with executive functioning difficulties don't necessarily know where to start or what's important. Another aspect of prioritizing, this is specifically for school, is thinking about points as money. So this concept is if you have different assignments that are due and some have more points or equal more money, you should be focusing more of your time and energy on those. So say you have a big math test that's about 50% of your whole grade, and you have maybe a small assignment that's about 2% of your whole grade. You want to make sure that you assess which one's most important. Obviously, the one that's 50% of your grade is most important. And so you need to spend more time and energy on things that are more important. Another aspect is limiting distractions. And this one is very important because we think that we're excellent multitaskers, but research has shown time and time again that our brains are not built for multitasking. It's very important that students have limited distractions in their work environment, especially when they're at home, especially things like music, even though you might get some pushback. Music does not help us study. Cell phones, games, social media, there's all sorts of other distractions, but limiting those will help students with executive functioning difficulties not have to process so much information at once, and they can just focus on what's important and do that task better ultimately. Another aspect is encouraging self-reflection. I bet all of us know exactly how we like to learn. You hear people say, I'm a visual learner, or I learn by doing. Well, your child also knows how they like to learn, or at least they're developing the skills to know how they like to learn. So it's important to foster this. It's important to ask them questions, to have them reflect on how they like to learn. So things like, what's different about the classes that you can focus in compared to the classes you can't really focus in? Or does your brain work better when your body is moving or when it's still? And the reason this is so important is because it is a starting point for problem solving. If your child is having difficulties, asking them to self-reflect and create a new solution to the issue might help a lot, both at school and at home. Another aspect is making it a game. When we receive information passively, we don't tend to learn it quite as well. It's important to activate our brain and create more focus. And one way to do this is to have a race against the clock. I do this for cleaning because I hate cleaning, but it really helps with homework or studying. So set a timer, it can be 10 minutes, up to an hour, don't make it too long, but have a race against the clock. That initiates a burst of energy and a burst of focus to help your child engage in that activity more fully. Also, you can do things like quiz yourself. So Quizlet and Brainscape are two websites that help you create quizzes and flashcards. What's important about quizzing yourself is understanding the information that you already know and what you don't know. And what's really important is to focus on what we don't know. We actually tend to learn better from our mistakes. So this is a way to prioritize our studying, but we don't need to focus on things we already know. We can maybe focus a little bit on things that we're not 100% sure on, but we absolutely need to focus on the questions we got wrong. And those questions that we got wrong are actually excellent opportunities to cement that information into our brain. And another aspect of making it a game is teaching an adult. Again, when we passively receive information, it doesn't necessarily stay in our brain quite as well as when we teach information. We engage in that information in a very different way when we actually have to produce it. Another benefit of teaching an adult is that you can feel smarter than your parent, and who doesn't want that? All right, so what can parents do right now? So the most important thing is to educate yourself, and you're doing that right now by being on this webinar. There's plenty of other resources to educate yourself. My favorite right now is Executive Function Podcast by Sarah Kesty. She is a teacher and educational coach, and she has so many different activities and strategies to help executive function deficits. And she always has a little pep talk at the end for students to get them motivated to work also. There's also articles and videos. There's plenty of resources online about executive function. Another thing you can do right now is to try some of the strategies we talked about. But please be flexible if they don't work right away. They are not meant to work right away as miracle cures. These are skills that take 28 years to learn. These strategies are going to help you boost that learning, but they will not completely help your child learn them immediately. So these are skills that we need to build over time. We would never expect a child to go into the first day of kindergarten knowing how to read. And so we should not expect them to come into school or come into a situation in which executive function is crucial and expect them to know how to do it. And lastly, please be patient and empathetic. Again, we're not supposed to know these skills until adulthood, so be patient with your child and be empathetic, but most importantly, be that to yourself also. We all need some grace right now.
Thank you, Jess, for sharing that.
Of course.
So we're going to close out with a couple of slides on adult modeling. And these are supports that any of us can provide as adults anytime, no matter what our role is, whether it's educator, caregiver, or someone in the community that's working with our child in a special capacity. One of the concepts around adult role modeling is called mirroring concept. And what that involves is projecting in our persona, in our posture, our body language, our voice tone, and our words, what we want the other person to feel and express. So in training for physicians, for example, emergency room training, they are told to acquire an emergency room posture. No matter what they are walking into, when they go in to help someone in the emergency room, they mirror calm, they mirror the fact that they're confident, there are things they can do to help, that things are going to be okay, and that they're going to move forward, and this is the right place to be to get help. That's usually called the emergency room posture. And it allows the patient or whoever's in the emergency room to calm down, to have confidence, and to have hope, and to know that they're in good hands. And so as parents, often we have to do this as well. So regardless of our personal stressors at the moment, maybe work was very stressful during the day, maybe there are financial considerations that are in the back of our mind. When working with our children, what we want to do is mirror calm and mirror confidence and mirror problem solving. That's very healthy to them. So we want to kind of take on that persona of what we hope they will perceive, what we hope they will experience. Another way to do this is using very gentle directive language when we meet resistance. So if I have a student who doesn't want to wear their mask, I don't have to kind of beg or plead for that. We can just make it a simple directive. We're going to put our mask on now, and we're moving forward. So sometimes that's ways also to kind of model expectations. We also want to think about our messaging and spillage from our own stress, that we don't allow that to spill over or spill out into our messaging. The beauty of messaging is that we have endless options. So there are many ways to positively express things that energize others, and there are many ways that we can express things that may create fear or anxiousness. And there's some examples here. For example, we can tell children repeatedly to be careful, be careful. There's germs out there, there's an epidemic out there. Or we can tell them to please take care of themselves. Here's the things we do to take care of ourselves. It's a different kind of message, and it's going to get a different kind of response for us. Another example might be sending children to school with the message, stay away from everyone. Or we can give the message, please honor people's space. We want to give everybody 6 foot of space. I want to make sure we honor that. Third example might be telling a child, follow all the safety rules. If we give that message too often, it can actually raise the anxiousness. Another way we could say it is, please be the leader in safety, or you can be that leader, or you can show others how to be safe. And that second message will energize behavior in a different way from the constant repeated caution messages. Other ways that we can model for students during stressful times includes coping with uncertainty in very healthy ways. So that might be teaching them to just take one day or one task at a time. It might also include limiting media, limiting our own exposure. So for example, viewing media that's very caution oriented, talking about a pandemic 2 hours a day has a very different kind of response from us than if we are just viewing that 5 minutes a day to get the important information that we need. Some people think of it as being analogous to choosing the size of our dinner plate. We can put a heaping dinner plate that's 5 inches tall, or we can put a dinner plate that has selective portions and just approach that a little bit at a time during that meal. One of those choices is going to be easier for us. So that's a way that we can take things a little bit at a time and model it for children. We also can be cognizant of the fact that children don't have a script from past epidemics. They don't have a script from past national emergencies. We might have one in our head, but they don't. So we can help them write the script in a very positive manner. We don't have to project forward maybe a negative script that we've heard somewhere else or we've experienced somewhere else. Creating support bridging is another strategy for modeling. So not just modeling ourselves as the adults in a child's life, but also thinking about bringing in other generations from our extended family. Many of them have lived through similar circumstances, and they have done so successfully. So having them as role models and extending that modeling process to multiple healthy role models is also a way to enhance the coping mechanisms that our students are going to have. We also might think about that as models of older students or children, other grade levels, siblings, and supporting that. Another way to model adjustment and coping when things are stressful, and it's important to acknowledge that there are some real stressors. Things can be stressful right now, is to think about building new traditions. Some examples might be camping out at home. Can't necessarily travel a great deal, but you can throw a sheet over the bed and make a tent out of it. You can camp in the backyard or the patio, in throw a tent over the sofa and camp out there. So there's a lot of creative ways. The one picture that you see in the far right is a family that I saw in Hillsborough County as I was driving along the expressway, and they had moved their picnic into the water for social distancing. So they had a folding aluminum table and a tent. Their food is out there on the table, and they're just having their picnic that way. For children, that could be great fun. That could be an adventure. But it's a way of building a different tradition and still being mindful of safety and precaution. Another strategy might be putting students in charge of selecting a new food at the grocery store, or creating a new meal that the family's never had before. And there are endless ways to do this, but just modeling, creating new ways of coping and thinking and living that are healthy. Lastly, there are strategies around embracing change. So part of that could be recognizing what's already been accomplished. Children have already successfully navigated this for more than 6 months. So celebrating the precautions they've taken, the adaptations they've made, the new things they've learned around virtual learning, for example, and taking time to really celebrate those tiny little daily successes are ways to model healthy change. And last but not least, also expressing gratitude for all of the things that are going well on that day-to-day level. So those are a number of ways adults can model coping that's healthy, that's productive, that our children will learn from us. And we did want to leave one last word in lieu of parents and caregivers' role and responsibilities. And that being that you know your children best, you know them well. There's a great love and depth of love within families that's not necessarily duplicated often. So that's to be cherished, and that you do have irreplaceable insights into that student and child to offer during this time of change. We would hope that those insights that you have about what your child needs and what works for them could also be shared with the school, so that we can be better at our jobs in supporting children. And that concludes our presentation for today. There are a few websites here that have additional handouts for you that also may be helpful.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Joyce and Jess, Ms. Bozzoli. This was really great information. And also, everyone, so the webinar recordings will be shared in lots of places for families through email and the announcements on the website and social media and on the PK website. On the Student and Family Services page, as well as on the virtually PK page of the website. And then additionally, as we meet with families each day, we are sharing these webinars and resources and tips all the time. So please feel free to share all of this information with families if you found it to be helpful, and send them to the website and say, hey, check out this webinar that I found really interesting and helpful for my family. And just all of this gets the word out to our PK community and provides support to everybody. And we appreciate all the support that you are providing to your student during this unusual school year, and for tuning into this webinar to learn about all the different ways that you can support your student during this pandemic. And all of us here at PK, we're here to partner with you and to help you navigate all of this. And so we're so grateful for you and your partnership, and we look forward to connecting with you. So we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.